Now, I don't know whether you saw it because it went out relatively early this morning. I sent everybody an email, a questionnaire about the website, which I hope you all look at. I know you read the really excellent Silurian News edited by Bernie Kirsch, and now we're going to be more digital as well. And so we'd like to put more news about Silurians on our website. And Barbara Lovenheim, who is on the board, has, and Bill Deal, also a board member, are going to handle trying to collect information and send it to Fred Herzog, who's our webmaster, who's also here, and does a great job with the web. But we want to make it a little spiffier and have news about you all there. Now, Bill Deal is going to also coordinate items that members think are of interest to other members about the news business, whether it's the layoffs at the New York Times or Edward Snowden's latest revelation or whatever. So I will send another email with the two email addresses for Barbara to whom you should address info about yourself. And send pictures, JPEGs and Word documents, please. That makes it easy, according to Fred. And so I hope you'll all participate and look at the website more often. And if you feel like reminiscing, let us know. Next, I want to thank our first Vice President, Betsy Ashton, for, at the request of some of us who are challenged, increasing the eyesight visibility of the name tags. Everybody like the bigger type? Okay. So I'm urged by Betsy to have you all return them to the bowl because these are not only recyclable, they were the cheaper option to getting you tattooed with your own name. I don't know, I trust you all heard Betsy, the bowl is outside. Also, I would like to welcome some new members. I will start with a new but not quite as fresh as the other member who insists that I failed to introduce him once. John Martin, my old colleague from ABC. John, please stand up. Now, Rita Satz, who was here last time I introduced, but she's a new member. Mike Eisgrau. Mike, you may recognize him from the radio. Andrea Sachs. Betsy Osha. And Dan Basis, who is a Reuters reporter who I also work with at CNN, who I know is on vacation today, so he's going to miss it, unfortunately. So now it's time for the main event. I could say lots about Lucinda and her wonderful new book, which we will have available for a bargain, a steal of a price, $16 thanks to her publisher. I believe she will be able to be persuaded to sign them for you. And I have them right up here after the show. It's not a show. Fred Friendly would say, we don't call this a show. This is a newscast. Anyway, the book, Timeless, Love, Morgenthau and Me, is just sensational. And when I talk about Lucinda being fearless, I'm sure many of us in the room have sat down and thought about writing stuff about our own personal behavior and said, you know, I'm not sure I can do that. It takes guts to do it, and then send it out, hit send. And Lucinda has done it. I am not a great believer in the notion that there's too much information. If you're squeamish, too bad. Lucinda, as you all probably know, does have a Pulitzer-Prize in her possession, along with Tom Powers, for their coverage at UPI about the Weatherman bombing of the townhouse on West 11th Street in 1970. And her career only went on and upward from there. She was at the New York Times and has written for many other places, and she and I most recently convened for a while at the Daily Beast, where we each were writing pieces of the Madoff story. I could go on about her husband, but why? Everybody knows he's the famous New York District Attorney Robert Morgenthau. I was happy to see in Lucinda's book that I'm not the only person who's been interviewing Robert Morgenthau when he suddenly became hard of hearing, repeatedly to the same question, no matter how close you got to his ears and were yelling at him, especially with the camera rolling. Apparently it happened in more intimate circumstances than that from time to time. And I guess on that pillow talk note, it's time for Lucinda.
Thank you so much, Alan. I am really honored to be among my compatriots and probably the most intelligent audience I've spoken to yet. So thank you. Thank you all for coming. I thought I'd begin at the beginning. The last thing I wanted to do was marry my husband. Bob Morgenthau was a widower almost 3 decades older, came with 5 children, a cat, and 2 dogs, and resided in a suburban house barely touched since the death of his wife 5 years before. It looked like this. On the lowboy in the hall was a mound of unopened mail that a casual breeze could have sent cascading to the floor. The chintz sofa with its fat golden flowers had gone vapid. The illusion of a spring bounty passed to winter gorse. Little crystal bowls were filled with shriveled nuts. Not only that, this man, the stereotype of the bourgeoisie, had the power to put me in jail. And this was supposed to be the man of my dreams? I had barely escaped incarceration anyway, emptying balloons of pig's blood on draft files in various cities, trespassing on government property, and chaining myself to the wrought iron White House fence. It was the 70s, the early 70s, and I felt a gnawing shame whenever I thought of Vietnam, which was much of the time. An ethos of death permeated my generation. That long after we were losing the war, we were still dropping almost 3 million tons of bombs on Cambodia made me crazy. That we had killed student protesters for no good reason made me especially crazy. If you were intelligent and young, you were trying to figure out how to be sane in an insane world. It never occurred to me that a member of the establishment, a man born into the same culture as the deluded architects of the Vietnam War, would be the answer. Bob Morgenthau came from one of New York's most distinguished German Jewish families, who were steeped in statesmanlike politics. I was steeped in Gentile society, raised in a Boston suburb where the men wore yellow pants and red jackets, and the lawns were trimmed as short as their haircuts. I let it all hang out, while Bob calmly kept it in. He was cautious, steady, a sloop balanced at dead center. I was a catamaran, racing breakneck through every channel I encountered. While he was aggressively enforcing the law, I had become dedicated to breaking it. The very notion that we should come together was an oxymoron. A few months later, I can't get enough of him. I switch from channel to channel, trying to understand his baffling persona. The husband I know has the sweet cadence of an oboe, and the husband I don't speaks with an Old Testament fury. I am transfixed by this other you, this scowling prosecutor who makes the most hardened reporters, merciless with others, pay obeisance. Out in the world, you leave a heavy footprint, but here at home, you come so softly through our door, I can barely hear you. You greet me with that little smile, crescent moon against a sky of gold, then cast your eyes down and look up shyly, like a bird that cannot be caught. I, however, have walked happily into my cage. Recognized from my journalist, I could fly anywhere I wished. But you are a public icon, and my mission is clear. Take care of him, your cousins and friends warned me grumpily. He is a national treasure. The disapproval of our friends and family brought us closer together. We were so alike in dash and spirit, no stereotype could fit us. We were giddy with the concept of agelessness. The years between us had closed. If one day the gap widened and we couldn't love each other with our bodies, we'd love with our minds. Words by the million have been printed about you, but none have revealed your real life, your secret life, that you belong to me. Last night, the city of New York owned you, but now as the sun rises, you are mine. Light falls upon your exquisite forehead. The hand beneath your cheek rumples your lips. I gently place my fingers on your lids and feel the rapid flutter of your eyes, the wings of a hummingbird. Such are the things that make love ache. Only when I take your craggy hand, mine so soft and round against it, when I run my fingers over the sharpness of your bones, do I remember you are twice as old as I am, twice as worldly, and twice as close to life's end. At times, I have felt your heart pounding so fast, it seems as if it will burst through your chest. Terrible things have happened to older men in this situation. 2 ancient popes expired in flagrante delicto. So did Nelson Rockefeller. And so, incredibly, did Attila the Hun. I always listen for your breathing. Once when I woke up, I couldn't hear a thing. Your chest was still, no heartbeat at all. I began thumping on your sternum. Breathe, breathe, I pleaded. You jumped up, gasping. You thought I was crazy. But I intend to keep you alive. I will feed you what you love, white peaches dripping with juice, lobsters so fresh they snap up their tails. I will keep you moving and thinking and teach you to shout and to curse. Everything you do will be of importance to me. I will make love stop time. The connection between Bob and I began when I had just come from London, having been a reporter for UPI there for about 5 years. I was assigned by UPI the Watergate scandal. They told me, go interview this fellow, Bob Morgenthau. He's been fired by Nixon and he knows all the scoop on the dirty dealings of Nixon's cronies. So I went to Morgenthau's office knowing nothing about the American government. I asked detail after detail, and finally he thought to himself that I was either the dumbest reporter or the smartest he'd ever met. After he read my story, he decided I was the smartest. The interview that we had somehow made my hippie poncho stick in Bob's mind. He couldn't get it out of his mind. I also kind of thought every once in a while about his magnificent forehead, but just, in passing. But he began to pursue me. Unfortunately, I was living with a draft dodger, and Roger the Dodger never told me that Bob had called. He called several times over a year. He's a very patient man, And finally, he got me a job on the New York Times so that he could get hold of me because I would have my own desk and my own telephone. So he became a news source of mine, as several of you know, but I never had a clue that there was any romantic feelings from him or from me. After all, I was in my 20s and he was 50-something, an old man. One day, he asked me on a date. I thought he wanted to sell me a story. He asked me to go to Arthur Schlesinger's home to meet Jimmy Carter, who was running for president against Reagan. Well, I decided I might as well dress up, so I put on my best silk peasant blouse, my bell-bottoms, my platform shoes. We walked into Arthur Schlesinger's home, and it was a ghastly fairyland of satin and sequins and feather boas around swan-thin necks. I felt like a homeless person, and people looked at me as though I was also. One person, Marjorie Oakes, asked me if I worked for Mr. Morgenthau. I was about to retreat into a back room when in came Jackie Kennedy Onassis, who had not been seen very often since she had hidden out on the yacht of Ari Onassis. She came in dressed in white, and the society ladies dropped their jaws and smiled dumbly at her. And I looked up at Bob. He was smiling too, but not at Jackie. He was smiling at me. Our romance after that moved very quickly. I thought it, he did too. It was absurd. We were opposites in every way. When we announced we were getting married, my family, his family, our friends went into shock. It was as though the Pope had asked Squeaky Fromme to marry him. Of course, all this disapproval brought us closer. As many of you know, if there's one thing Bob hates, it's to be told he can't do something. But professionals 30 years apart didn't marry in the 70s, so we married anyway. Timeless is a love story that explores how an unlikely relationship like ours has endured for more than 3 decades. It's unsparing in revealing our foibles, our illusions, the things we did that were not so smart. It takes the reader through our highs and lows and the strategies we developed for reinventing our marriage during the times when it foundered. But Timeless is not only about relationship, it's about a political history of an era. It's our journey through 36 years in the public eye as seen through a private lens. Robert Morgenthau, as all of you know, is one of the great men of our time, the only prominent statesman left over from the Kennedy era. He has made new law with many of his criminal cases and invented the prosecution of white-collar crime as we know it today. DA of New York for 30 years, he has seldom stayed within his jurisdiction. Instead, he has gone after sacred cows the federal system didn't dare touch. His long arm has stretched into foreign waters, cultivating a network of global espionage partners, including the Mossad and British intelligence. He has unraveled international money laundering and indicted bank presidents who were working on behalf, first of drug dealers and then later of terrorist organizations. Law enforcement agencies were not only reluctant to look into these cleverly complex cases, often fronted by high-profile people, many didn't even understand them. When Bob first took on the case of BCCI, he did this because nobody at the U.S. Attorney's Office really understood it. The amount of documents were stacked about 10 10 piles high. His ADAs did not understand it. So Bob flipped through, within an hour, he had it, and he had to explain it to them. He's really good at math. Then, in the middle of his investigation of BCCI, I don't know whether any of you or many of you know this, the U.S. Attorney General and the CIA tried to sabotage BCCI investigation for nefarious reasons that I detail in Timeless. Just before he retired at age 90, Bob caught two huge banks, Lloyd's of London and Credit Suisse, conspiring to help Iran build a nuclear bomb. In spite of the U.S. sanctions against Iran, the banks had laundered $1 billion for the Iranians, who ironically used the money to buy uranium and other materials from America. There is much more to Bob's investigations into international terrorism, which have remained unpublicized until now. But just to give you a little teaser, it came into his possession tapes giving instructions for bombing the World Trade Center, for fueling planes that would go into the World Trade Center, and blueprints for 9/11. He tried to warn the FBI. He went to Washington. He went to the CIA, and to no avail. Nobody wanted his advice. Nobody wanted to listen to him. And then 9/11 happened. I did research of my own after 9/11 and put together various documents which pointed to the role of the intelligence agencies in strengthening al-Qaeda until they were ready to undertake their greatest, most monstrous attack on America. Timeless also focuses on the more human side of Bob and me. It peels back the layers to expose the real Bob Morgenthau behind the stern, unbending, enigmatic prosecutor, the man who has kept his personal life a question mark for nearly half a century of public service. Bob is a soul of many secrets, and one of them I'll give you a hint about. For years, he has been a highly functioning victim of post-traumatic stress disorder. My book explores why he has suffered from this condition, how he has handled it, and the consequences of burying the memories that he has never been able to express. One of the ways that Bob and I have stayed so close is that we've helped each other in our careers. Although we had a very thick line between my writing about his cases or he messing with my stories, together we would brainstorm some of his cases, as well as map out strategies for me in my quest to get a story. One of the hardest stories I did involved the long, nerve-wracking struggle I went through to get the first, and unfortunately the last, interview that Hillary Clinton gave about the Monica Lewinsky affair. Another was how I found that red dye number 2, which permeated our food supply, was carcinogenic. I tell the story of how people began to refuse to eat maraschino cherries and red velvet cake, and finally protested so much that the FDA banned the dye. As for Bob's famous cases, the inside information I reveal is sometimes surprising and sometimes shocking. I tell you the real story behind the Central Park jogger, but I don't want to spoil it for those of you who want to read the book. Instead, if I have time, I'll read a little segment about another well-known case. On January 7th, 1998, Bob got a strange call from the niece of a Holocaust survivor who said the Nazis had stolen an Egon Schiele painting from her aunt and the family had been trying to get it back for more than half a century. Within a day, without any legal precedent, Bob slapped a subpoena on the Museum of Modern Art and took the famous painting off its walls and put it into official custody. What was fascinating to me as the case unfolded in our dining room was the story behind the story. The fallout began with Ronald Lauder, son of Estee Lauder, a billionaire, and you know what else. He was also the august chairman of the city's MoMA, and after the seizure of this canvas that Sheila had done of his mistress called Portrait of Wally, he strode awkwardly into Bob's office, chin thrust forward, jutting brows, casting a shadow over eyes luminous with indignation. The DA, having no precedent, had seized his most favorite painting. "It doesn't even belong to us," Lauder said during this private meeting. "We borrowed it from the Austrian government, and we have to give it back." "It doesn't appear to belong to Austria," Bob replied evenly. "It appears to have been stolen by Nazi looters from a Jew." That Jew was one Leah Bondi, Sheila's supporter and dealer, who had been trying for much of her life to get back the exceptional piece of art. Lent by the Austrian Leopold Museum, this work of the artist, who was the harbinger of Expressionism in the earliest 20th century, had had a journey through time as twisted, grotesque, and deathly as one of Sheila's figurative portraits. If Lauder loved the work, it had also been cherished by Bondi, who had hung it in her living room before it was confiscated by a Nazi and eventually passed on to the government of Austria, part of a massive reward for capitulating to Hitler. "It seems to me you have a conflict of interest in this case," Bob said, referring to the MoMA board's dismissive treatment of the Bondi heirs, who had pleaded with them not to ship off the Sheila. "Well, I guess I do wear two hats," Lauder admitted, suddenly subdued. "I'd say you wore three," Bob replied. "You are a collector of Sheila paintings that have no provenance. You are a chairman of MoMA, and being its former U.S. ambassador, you are a friend of Austria." "Oh, you're going to ruin the art world," Lauder said. "People won't be able to enjoy art exhibitions without lending between museums, and no museum will turn over their best art if they might not get it back. There are rules of lending between museums worldwide. Are we supposed to break those because Robert Morgenthau decides we should?" "It's not my decision. It's the law. We did extensive research. We obtained affidavits, including one from the world's leading Sheila expert, before we moved against you." A disgruntled Lauder left the office, but at our home, a landslide of vitriol began to bury us. The phone rang incessantly. We were inundated with threats, irate letters from board chairman of the New York Public Library, and every museum in New York, including the Jewish Museum. The most harrowing letter came from Arthur O. Sulzberger, the mighty chairman of both the New York Times Company and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He had been a very good friend of Bob's. Bob had been the Bondi's family's last chance because they'd gone to the U.S. Attorney's Office, the State Department in Washington, who had brushed them off, and with time running out, they decided to try this man Morgenthau, who was known to be a maverick. Everyone predicted Bob would fail. "You know, there's nothing that gets my blood up more than being told I can't do something," my husband recounted to me over the phone. "But I have to do it fast, and there's the small problem of New York law. There's a statute that says cultural properties on loan in New York are indemnified from seizure and must be returned to lending institutions. Well, sweetheart, why don't you get hold of Judah Gribbets? He was an expert on Nazi looting. And tell him to drop everything and try to find a little hole in the law that you can crawl through. And that is what he did. Clock was ticking. They had only 24 hours before it was scheduled to go back to Austria. But Judah found the loophole. Although it was open to interpretation, the statute protecting art lending institutions seemed to be confined to civil actions, not criminal. "You are amazing," I cheered. I thought of how hard Bob was working to raise money for New York's first Holocaust museum, how steeped he was in the plight of the Holocaust survivors. Now he had been presented with an opportunity to seek retribution for one family of victims. "If your husband wins this," Judah said, "he will have set a precedent. A huge amount of stolen art has just been wandering around Europe since the war. Most Holocaust survivors have been resigned to having lost everything. They just didn't think they could ever get it back. I don't think there's been another case like this anywhere in the world." Newspapers wrote editorials speculating that Morgenthau might be responsible for shutting down smaller museums and galleries that depended on borrowed art. The Austrian press accused him of making heists typical of his race and of forcing the art world into a banana republic. With many of the city's powerful figures, newspapers, and museums arrayed against him, he felt as though we were fighting behind the Alamo. "It's upsetting," he admitted, and this was the first time I had ever seen him really upset about a case. It languished in the federal courts for 9 years until finally the Leopold Museum of Austria capitulated and settled with the Bondis by buying the painting for an inflated price of $19 million. The agreement stipulated that Portrait of Wally be displayed at Bob's Museum of Jewish Heritage for 3 weeks before being returned, and be hung with the story of the painting's deceptive, peripatetic provenance on the wall. Bob's actions caused a revolution in the international art world and had as far-ranging effects as anything he had ever done. "Everybody's thinking more about provenance today than they were yesterday," said Philippe de Montebello, director of the Metropolitan. New York drafted a bill requiring art purchasers to do background checks to see if the art was stolen or face losing the work in court. It also provided $15 million for organizations that helped locate looted art. Museums began to willingly return artworks to their rightful owners. Panels were created to help families trace their losses. Wartime archives were opened. Even the shamed Austrian government joined the rush. It gave 250 works of art worth $100 million to the Rothschild family, which had been stripped of its treasures after Hitler annexed Austria. Within a year, the United States had signed the groundbreaking Washington Conference on the Principles of Nazi Confiscated Art. Governments and museums in 44 nations pledged to repair the damage Nazi looters had done to Jewish owners for half a century. People ask me often why I wrote this book and why I wrote it now. And I want to tell you why. There are 2 reasons. First of all, writers and publishers have been besieging Bob for years to write his memoirs, to have somebody write a biography. And Bob knew that he had to do it, or it had to be done. But he didn't want to do it himself. He didn't want to look back. He liked the idea of me doing it because I already knew a good part of his life. He wouldn't have to do the work, I would. Second, What was my reason for asking him if I could write this memoir? Like many of you, I have to feel a subject before I can write about it. And I not only felt Bob, I had the irony and the distance and the love of 36 years together in order to portray him as the character he is. I also felt that Bob no longer belonged just to me, but to all the people in all his humanity. Thanks.